In this video, I'd like to do a series of multiple choice examples involving the three main heat transfer mechanisms. I've summarized all three of them here by saying conduction involves heat going through a solid material, basically heating through a solid material. I realize in all three of these, I think I've used or maybe abused the original definition of the word heat, which maybe demonstrates how easy it is to do that because I'm treating heat as if it were a thing, whereas heat is really supposed to be a process. Convection, fluid flows carrying heat. So that's another example. How do you really carry a process? So it's really, it maybe should be that heating is happening because fluid is flowing and carrying thermal energy. But I didn't want to say something that complicated. With radiation, it's really electromagnetic radiation that transfers heat. That one actually might be stated a bit more correctly there. And it turns out this last one opens a big can of worms that maybe we don't want to open just yet, because you could ask, like, well, what is the nature of this one? And in particular, what do you mean by electromagnetic radiation? Is that like light? And the answer is yes, but it's also infrared radiation, or you could say infrared light that we cannot see at temperatures that are normal here on Earth. It's usually going to be infrared radiation, but it really winds up depending on temperature, and that's already opening that can of worms a bit much because that really gets into some modern physics ideas. So maybe for now this will be good enough for answering these questions. So this first question says, if I'm sitting on a cold metal bench while waiting for the bus, what heat transfer mechanism is most likely responsible for my shivering? And I have this nice picture of a metal-looking bench that might be at a bus station somewhere. And the four choices I'm given are conduction, convection, radiation, and Pluto? That seems kind of weird. Well, maybe whoever wrote this had a strange sense of humor about Pluto. Obviously, that's not going to be the answer, right? That's obviously a joke. It seems like this fits the definition of conduction, though, right? Because really, I mean, I said heat through solid material. The bench might be a solid material. You could also say conduction is what happens just when you touch, when you're in contact with something that is solid. Heat will naturally transfer between the two objects if there is a temperature difference. So in this case, I am probably warmer than this cold metal bench. I am at a higher temperature, so heat will transfer from me into the bench by conduction. So that's A, and there it is. That's the answer. So let's look at the next question here. If Eddie is standing in a cold breeze, and there's a picture of Eddie, old friend of mine, what heat flow mechanism is most likely responsible for his shivering? And I picked this picture because it was from a trip a long time ago. And it was kind of cold, and I think he was trying to convey that with the look on his face. I don't know if it's really working, but the question is good, though, because it tells us there's a cold breeze. That's maybe a clue that there's something flowing, right? And it turns out a fluid in physics can either be a gas or a liquid. It doesn't necessarily have to be like water or some other liquid. It can also be cool air. And so I'm going to say convection, therefore, is the answer. Oh, before I put that up, the joke answer changed. It is now turnips. Hopefully we can all recognize that that's clearly not the correct answer there, but convection is. All right. If a person is sitting out in the sun, what is the heat transfer mechanism most likely responsible for the person getting warm? So we have a picture here of a person doing something in a raft. It's actually from that same trip. In the sun, maybe getting warm. And of course, that's an example of radiation, right? Because there's sunlight, there's also some infrared, there's also some ultraviolet, which might not be good if I don't want to get skin cancer. But in any case, those are all forms of electromagnetic radiation, and in addition to possibly damaging some of my skin cells, they are definitely transferring heat into me, or wait, no, this person here who may or may not be me. Interestingly enough, there's now the joke answer is perspiration, which may result from the heat that is transferred into me, but is not really the mechanism here. So radiation, C, is the correct answer. If I get out of a river after going swimming and suddenly feel cold as my skin dries, what is most likely responsible for my feeling cold, right? And, okay, well, is that one of the heat transfers? Because we have conduction, convection, radiation, and now the joke answer has turned into evaporation. Is that really a joke, though, still, maybe, is the question, because that's starting to sound a little bit more reasonable, because it turns out there's a subtlety sometimes. You know, some heat transfers get a little more complicated maybe than these three categories kind of are adequate towards describing. And this might be one of them, because what's actually happening is, like, when I get out of the river, I'm wet, of course, right? And now that water that is on me is evaporating. And as we saw with latent heats, in fact, you might recall from the example there that the largest heat involved, we did one with ice melting, but it turns out this is actually going to be more true if you look up the latent heat of vaporization for water. It's quite large. And so the amount of heat that is required to evaporate that water from my skin, which is what's going to happen, is actually quite large. And a lot of that heat is going to come from me and actually cool me down a lot. So that actually makes evaporation the correct answer here, even though it wasn't one of the three established heat transfer mechanisms in the original key concepts page. And I'm not really saying that evaporation is a heat transfer mechanism, but it definitely involves, in fact, one could argue it's probably really by conduction that the heat transfers from me into the water that is evaporating, but definitely it is involved with why human beings may sometimes have heat transferring out of them, in addition to the three basic heat transfer mechanisms. So here's another question. If the temperature outside is hotter than a person's body temperature, by what mechanism does the human body keep our temperature lower? And the choices are conduction, convection, radiation, and perspiration. And the correct answer here is what was, again, the joke answer before, but now is the correct answer, is perspiration. But maybe there's more to the story, because what happens is when I perspire, even if I didn't just go swimming, right, I create moisture on my skin, which then evaporates, which then cools me down. So there's a lot of this thermal physics we've been discussing involved with this. So these last couple of questions, I think, jumped a little bit outside of the domain of the topic we're in, but hopefully that's at least been interesting to check out. And this picture is maybe a little humorous as well.